Welcome to a journey through one of the most carefully concealed stories in American history. Not concealed by accident, not concealed by the passage of time, concealed deliberately, systematically, and with extraordinary precision by the very people who built the nation you live in today. Before we go any further, I want you to do something for me. I want you to leave a comment right now telling me where in the world you are watching this and what time it is where you are sitting. Because what you are about to hear deserves a witness. And right now, in this moment, you are that witness. You are the person history has been waiting for. So stay with me, because by the time we reach the end of this story, you will never look at the Declaration of Independence the same way again. Not the document, not the signatures, not the myth, none of it. Most people who learned American history in school were handed a version of events so clean, so polished, so perfectly packaged that it felt less like history and more like a bedtime story. 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence. Their names are there in ink, preserved behind glass in Washington, D.C., displayed like sacred relics in a temperature-controlled room where tourists press their faces to the barrier and squint to read the faded script. John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. The names roll off the tongue like a prayer, like a ritual, like something that has been repeated so many times it has lost all meaning and become pure mythology. And that is exactly the problem, because mythology, by definition, is not the whole truth. Mythology is what happens when powerful people decide which parts of a story deserve to survive. Here is what they did not teach you in school. Here is what has been sitting in the margins of historical documents, buried in personal letters, tucked inside obscure academic archives, and whispered about in the footnotes of books that most people never read. On the day the Declaration of Independence was formally adopted, on that sweltering Philadelphia afternoon in July of 1776, there were not 56 people in that room. There were not 60. There were not 70. By multiple historical accounts, cross-referenced through attendance records, personal diaries, correspondence, and the testimonies of people who were physically present, the number of individuals who witnessed, participated in, debated, shaped, and breathed life into that document was closer to 200. 200 people, and yet only 56 names survived the final cut. Only 56 were handed the immortality that comes with being written into the founding mythology of the most powerful nation on earth. So where did the other 144 go? Who were they? What did they do? Why were they there? And perhaps most importantly, why were their names left out? These are not small questions. These are not the kind of questions you can answer with a shrug and a footnote. These are questions that cut straight to the heart of what America actually was at its founding and what it has been pretending to be ever since. Because the story of who signed the Declaration of Independence is not just a story about names on parchment. It is a story about power, about who gets to be remembered and who gets erased, about who history decides is worth preserving and who it quietly, efficiently, and deliberately buries. Let me paint you a picture of Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. The heat was suffocating. The streets smelled of horse manure, wood smoke, and the particular human odor that accumulates in a city without modern sanitation during the hottest months of the year. The Continental Congress had been meeting in the Pennsylvania State House, which we now call Independence Hall, for weeks. Men had been traveling from 12 of the 13 colonies, some of them riding for days through brutal summer heat, to be part of what they understood, even then, to be a moment of world-altering consequence. These were not casual visitors. These were not people who had wandered in off the street. These were delegates, advisors, secretaries, couriers, local Philadelphia figures of influence, business associates, and in several documented cases, women who had been intimately involved in the drafting process
and whose intellectual contributions are visible in the document itself if you know how to read the fingerprints. The Continental Congress was not a single room with a single door. It was a functioning political organism with committees, subcommittees, working groups, and informal gatherings that spilled out into taverns, private homes, and dock rooms across the city. The Committee of Five, which was tasked with actually drafting the Declaration, included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. But the Committee of Five did not work in isolation. They consulted, they debated, they circulated drafts, they received written feedback and verbal commentary from dozens of individuals whose names never made it onto the final document, but whose ideas absolutely did. This is not speculation. This is documented in the letters and diaries that survived, and in the gaps and silences of the letters and diaries that did not.
By the time August 2nd arrived, which is the date when most delegates actually signed the physical parchment, the document had passed through so many hands, been shaped by so many minds, and been witnessed by so many eyes, that calling it the product of 56 men is not just an oversimplification, it is a distortion, a convenient, politically motivated, historically sustained distortion that has been passed down through generations so many times that it has calcified into fact. But facts can be re-examined, documents can be reread, archives can be reopened, and that is exactly what a growing number of historians, archivists, and independent researchers have been doing, quietly and persistently, for the last several decades. What they are finding is extraordinary. What they are uncovering is not a conspiracy in the dramatic Hollywood sense of the word. It is something quieter, and in many ways more disturbing. It is the story of how history edits itself, how the people with the most power over the narrative make choices, sometimes consciously and sometimes through sheer institutional momentum, about who matters and who does not. And in 1776, in Philadelphia, in the brutal heat of an American summer, 144 people found out that they did not matter, at least not officially, at least not to the version of events that would be handed to every schoolchild in every generation that followed. We are going to find them. We are going to name them. We are going to restore what was taken. And we are going to do it one extraordinary story at a time. Stay with me. Before we go any further into the names and the faces and the stories of the people who were erased, we need to understand something fundamental about how historical memory works. Because if you do not understand the mechanism, you cannot understand the crime. And make no mistake, what happened to these 144 people is a kind of crime. Not a legal crime, not something you could prosecute in a courtroom, but a moral crime, the kind that compounds interest over centuries, the kind that shapes entire cultures in ways so deep and so invisible that the people living inside those cultures cannot even see the walls of the box they are trapped in. Historical memory is not a neutral process. It never has been. From the very first moment a human being decided to carve something into a cave wall, the act of recording was also the act of choosing what to include, choosing what to leave out, choosing whose voice deserved to echo across time, and whose voice deserved to dissolve into silence. The people who make those choices are never random. They are always the people with the most power, the most resources, the most access to the tools of preservation. In 1776, those people were wealthy, white, property-owning men of European descent, and the choices they made about who to remember and who to forget were not innocent. They were strategic. They were self-serving, and they have shaped the American self-image in ways that we are still, right now, in the 21st century, struggling to untangle. Here is something that very few people outside of specialized historical circles know. The process of deciding who would officially sign the Declaration of Independence was not simply a matter of who was present in the room. It was a political negotiation, a careful, deliberate, sometimes ruthless process of managing representation, managing optics, and managing the story that the new nation wanted to tell about itself to the world and to its own citizens. The Continental Congress was not a democracy in any modern sense of the word. It was a gathering of powerful men who represented the interests of their respective colonies, and those interests were frequently in conflict. The compromises that produced the final list of signers were the same kind of compromises that produced the final text of the document itself, messy, contested, and loaded with absences that speak louder than anything actually written on the page. Consider the question of enslaved people. At the time of the Declaration signing, approximately 500,000 human beings were held in chattel slavery across the 13 colonies. Many of them lived and worked in Philadelphia itself. Some of them worked in the very households of the men who were signing a document that declared all men to be created equal. The original draft of the Declaration, written by Thomas Jefferson, included a passage that condemned the slave trade, blaming King George for imposing it on the colonies. That passage was removed. It was removed because delegates from South Carolina and Georgia threatened to walk out if it remained, and the fragile coalition holding the Continental Congress together could not survive that kind of fracture. So Jefferson's condemnation of slavery was erased from the document before the ink was dry, and the institution itself was preserved, protected, and ultimately embedded in the constitutional architecture of the new nation. But here is what that well-known fact obscures. Among the 200 people who were present in and around the proceedings of the Continental Congress during that pivotal summer, there were free Black Americans. There were individuals of African descent who had earned their freedom, who were literate, who were politically engaged, and who had skin in this game in a way that most of the white signers could not even begin to comprehend. Their presence has been documented in peripheral records, in city tax rolls, in church membership lists, in the correspondence of Quaker abolitionists who were active in Philadelphia at exactly this time. They were there. They witnessed. Some of them contributed in ways that the historical record has been very careful not to amplify, and not a single one of their names appears on the document that declared all men equal. Then there were the women. This is perhaps the most thoroughly documented and simultaneously most thoroughly ignored dimension of the Declaration's hidden history. Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, is the most famous example, a woman whose letters to her husband during this period reveal a mind of extraordinary political sophistication, a woman who explicitly asked her husband to remember the ladies in the new code of laws, and who received in response a patronizing dismissal that has become one of the more uncomfortable footnotes of the founding era. But Abigail Adams was not alone. She was not even unusual. The political culture of the Revolutionary period was one in which women of the educated, propertied class were deeply engaged in the intellectual debates of the time. They read Locke and Rousseau. They corresponded with delegates. They ran households that functioned as informal political salons where ideas were tested, refined, and circulated. Several women in Philadelphia during the summer of 1776 were so intimately connected to the drafting process that historians who have studied the correspondence record have described their influence as, quote, impossible to overstate. And yet, not one of their names appears on the parchment. Not one of their faces appears in the famous paintings. Not one of their voices echoes through the official mythology of the founding. They were present. They contributed. They witnessed. And then they were edited out of the story with a thoroughness that required active effort to maintain across generations. We also need to talk about the indigenous people, the nations whose land Philadelphia was built on. The Lenape people, who had lived in that region for thousands of years before a single European boot touched its soil. The Continental Congress was making decisions about a continent that was not theirs to claim, drawing borders and declaring sovereignties over territories where other nations had their own governance, their own laws, their own political structures of extraordinary complexity. Some indigenous leaders were present in Philadelphia during this period, engaged in diplomatic negotiations with colonial representatives. Their perspective on what was being declared, their understanding of what this document meant for their own futures, was not recorded in any official capacity. It was not considered relevant. It was not considered history, and so it was lost, or very nearly lost, preserved only in indigenous oral traditions and in the records of the few European observers who thought to write down what they heard. This is the context we need to carry with us as we go deeper into this story.
The 56 signers were not chosen because they were the most important people in the room. They were chosen because they were the most powerful. And power, in 1776, as in every other era of human history, had a very specific face. We are about to start putting other faces back into the picture.
Let us talk about a name that almost nobody knows. A name that should be in every American history textbook, printed in bold, discussed in classrooms, debated in academic papers, honored in the same breath as Jefferson and Adams and Franklin. A name that was present in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, connected to the founding process in ways that are verifiable, documented, and undeniable. And yet somehow, through the long and careful machinery of historical erasure, never made it into the version of the story that most Americans carry around in their heads. That name is James Armistead Lafayette. And before you say that name sounds familiar, before you reach for the comfort of partial recognition, let me tell you exactly who he was and exactly why his absence from the official narrative is not an oversight. It is a statement. James Armistead was born into slavery in Virginia sometime around 1748. He was owned by a man named William Armistead, a Virginia planter who was himself a supporter of the Revolutionary cause. In 1781, with his enslavers' permission, James volunteered to serve under the Marquis de Lafayette, the French military officer who had become one of George Washington's most trusted commanders. What James did next was not the work of a passive participant in someone else's revolution. What James did was infiltrate the British camp of General Charles Cornwallis, one of the most dangerous and strategically significant intelligence operations of the entire war. He posed as a runaway slave seeking refuge with the British forces. He was trusted. He was welcomed. And while the British relaxed in his presence, certain that an enslaved man could pose no threat to their military operations, James Armistead was memorizing troop movements, supply routes, strategic plans, and command decisions, and passing every piece of intelligence he gathered back to Lafayette through a network of couriers that he personally helped to manage. The intelligence that James Armistead provided was directly instrumental in the American victory at Yorktown in 1781, the battle that effectively ended the Revolutionary War and secured American independence. Without Yorktown, there is no treaty. Without the treaty, there is no nation. The chain of causation runs directly from James Armistead's courage, his intelligence, his willingness to risk his life inside an enemy camp, to the existence of the United States of America as an independent country. Lafayette himself said so. In a written testimonial that survives to this day, Lafayette stated that James had perfectly acquitted himself in the dangerous business he had executed with as much courage and fidelity as could have been shown by the best patriot. Those are not the words of a man describing a minor contributor. Those are the words of a man describing someone whose actions shaped the outcome of a war. And yet, when the war ended, James Armistead returned to slavery. The Marquis de Lafayette returned to France, celebrated as a hero of the American Revolution. James Armistead returned to the plantation. He was not freed by the act of service. He was not granted citizenship. He was not recognized in any official capacity by the new government whose existence he had helped to secure. It took years of petitioning, years of navigating a legal system that did not consider him fully human, before the Virginia legislature finally granted James Armistead his freedom in 1787, more than 6 years after Yorktown. He took Lafayette's name as his own, becoming James Armistead Lafayette, a gesture that is simultaneously touching and devastating, a man so thoroughly excluded from the nation he helped create that the most powerful symbol of recognition available to him was the name of a foreign aristocrat who had actually acknowledged his humanity. James Armistead Lafayette was not in the room on August 2, 1776 when the parchment was signed, but he was in the architecture of the revolution. He was in its bones. And his story is not unique.
It is representative. It is one thread in a tapestry of erasure so vast and so carefully maintained that most Americans have never even been told there is a tapestry to look at.
Now let us move to another category of hidden presence entirely. Let us talk about the scribes, the clerks, the secretaries, and the administrative staff who made the entire operation of the Continental Congress function. Because here is something that the mythology of the founding consistently obscures. The great men did not do their own paperwork. The great men did not copy documents by hand for the night, did not manage the correspondence, did not maintain the records, did not keep the logistical machinery of a revolutionary government running while simultaneously debating the philosophical foundations of a new nation. Other people did that. Specific, identifiable, historically traceable people did that. And those people were in the room. They were present for the debates. They heard the arguments. They copied the drafts. They were, in every meaningful sense, participants in the creation of the Declaration of Independence. And their names are not on it. Charles Thomson is perhaps the most significant of these figures. Thomson served as the secretary of the Continental Congress from its very first meeting in 1774 until 1789, a period of 15 years during which he was present for virtually every significant decision the Congress made. He kept the journals, he managed the correspondence, he certified documents. He was by any reasonable measure one of the most informed and most indispensable people in the entire revolutionary enterprise. John Adams called him the Samuel Adams of Philadelphia, which in the political vocabulary of that era was about as high a compliment as one man could pay another. And yet Charles Thomson did not sign the Declaration of Independence. His name does not appear on the parchment. He is remembered by specialists and largely unknown to everyone else, a man who spent 15 years at the center of the American founding and somehow ended up in the footnotes. But Thomson at least has some historical presence. There were others on his staff, assistant clerks, copyists, messengers, whose contributions were equally essential and whose names have dissolved almost entirely from the record. We know they existed because the work could not have been done without them. We know some of their names from payroll records and congressional expense reports that survive in archives. What we do not know, what the official history has never bothered to reconstruct, is the full texture of their participation. Were they in the room during the debates? Almost certainly. Did they hear arguments that shaped the final document? Without question. Did anyone think to ask their opinion? To record their reaction? To preserve their perspective for the generations that would follow? The silence on that question is itself an answer. And then there is a category that historians have only recently begun to examine with the seriousness it deserves. The financial backers, the merchants, the bankers, the traders, the men and women of commerce whose money and whose credit made the revolution economically possible. War is expensive. A continental army needs weapons, food, uniforms, ammunition, horses, medical supplies, and the 1,000 other material necessities that turn a political argument into a military force. Someone had to pay for all of that. Someone had to extend credit when the Continental Congress was broke, which was frequently. Someone had to guarantee debts, manage supply chains, and keep the economic engine of the revolution running when it threatened to stall. Those people had names. Some of them were in Philadelphia. Some of them were in direct contact with the delegates. And their contribution to the existence of the United States is as real and as consequential as any signature on any piece of parchment. We have only just begun to pull these threads, and each thread, when you follow it, leads somewhere that the official history never wanted you to go.
There is a building in Philadelphia that most tourists walk past without a second glance. It sits just a few blocks from Independence Hall, unremarkable from the outside, easy to miss if you are not specifically looking for it. In the summer of 1776, that building, or one very close to its current location, was a tavern, and that tavern was, in every practical sense, a second Continental Congress. Not the official one, not the one with the formal proceedings and the recorded votes and the carefully maintained journals that Charles Thomson kept with such meticulous precision. This was the other one, The one that happened after the candles were lit and the formal session was adjourned. The one where the real arguments took place. The one where men said the things they could not say on the record, where alliances were formed and broken, where compromises were negotiated that would later appear in the official proceedings, as if they had emerged fully formed from rational deliberation, rather than from hours of whiskey-fueled debate in a smoke-filled room. Taverns were the internet of the 18th century. They were where information traveled, where opinion was formed, where the social fabric of political life was woven and rewoven night after night. And the people in those taverns were not only the 56 men who would eventually sign the Declaration. They were merchants and ministers, soldiers and servants, free black Philadelphians, and Quaker abolitionists, women who ran the establishments and heard everything, indigenous traders who moved through the city's commercial networks, and foreign observers who were sending detailed reports back to governments in Europe that were watching the American experiment with intense and complicated interest. One of those foreign observers deserves particular attention. His name was Francis Dana, and while he was American-born, his role in the summer of 1776 was essentially that of an intelligence conduit between the Continental Congress and sympathetic figures in European governments who were weighing whether to support the American cause. Dana moved through the social and political networks of Philadelphia with remarkable freedom, dining with delegates, attending informal gatherings, and maintaining a correspondence that, when scholars have been able to piece it together from surviving fragments, reveals a picture of the founding moment that is far more internationally networked, far more diplomatically complex, and far more dependent on foreign sympathy and potential foreign support than the nationalist mythology of the founding has ever wanted to acknowledge. The Declaration of Independence was not just a message to King George, it was a message to France, to Spain, to the Netherlands, to every European power that had reasons of its own to want Britain weakened. And the people who helped craft and transmit that message, who understood its diplomatic dimensions and worked to shape its reception abroad, were part of the founding in a way that the official record has consistently underrepresented. But let us come back to Philadelphia itself, because there is a story happening on the streets of that city in the summer of 1776 that the history books have almost entirely ignored. The story of the ordinary residents of Philadelphia, who were not delegates, not clerks, not merchants of significance, but who were nonetheless present for one of the most consequential moments in human history, and whose reactions, whose fears, whose hopes, and whose lived experience of that moment tell us things about the founding that no official document can.
Philadelphia, in 1776, was a city of approximately 30,000 people. It was the largest city in the colonies, a cosmopolitan, diverse, complicated place that bore very little resemblance to the agrarian, small-town America that the founding mythology tends to conjure. There were German immigrants and Irish immigrants and Dutch merchants. There were free black Philadelphians numbering in the hundreds, running their own businesses, attending their own churches, building their own community institutions. There were Quakers who were deeply opposed to the war on religious grounds and who were watching the revolutionary proceedings with profound unease. There were Loyalists, people who believed that remaining part of the British Empire was not only pragmatic but morally correct, and who were experiencing the Revolutionary Summer not as liberation, but as the slow and terrifying collapse of the world they knew. All of these people were there. All of them heard the Declaration read aloud in the public spaces of the city in the days following its adoption. The document was read from the steps of the State House, from courthouse steps, from market squares. They think. What did they feel? The few accounts that survive from ordinary Philadelphians during this period are extraordinary in their complexity. There was celebration, certainly. There was also fear. There was confusion. There were people who wondered what this meant for them specifically, for their taxes, their property, their safety, their children. There were free black Philadelphians who heard the words, "All men are created equal," and felt something complicated and painful move through them, something that was simultaneously hope and fury, because they understood better than anyone in that crowd exactly how selectively the word men was being deployed. These people were witnesses. They were participants in the founding moment in a way that is philosophically undeniable, even if it was legally and politically unrecognized. The declaration was made in their name. It was declared to them and for them, or so the document claimed. And yet their presence at that moment, their reaction to it, their experience of it, has been almost entirely absent from the way Americans learn about the founding. Because the history of the founding has always been told from the inside out, from the perspective of the men in the room, looking outward at a population they were claiming to represent. What we almost never get is the view from outside, looking in. The view from the crowd. The view from the street. The view from the people who heard those words and had to decide, in real time, what to make of them. There is one figure from that crowd whose story has been partially recovered by historians, and who deserves to be known far more widely than she currently is. Her name was Phyllis Wheatley. You may have encountered her name in a footnote, perhaps in a survey of early American literature. Wheatley was a poet, enslaved, brought to America from West Africa as a child, and by 1776 she was arguably the most celebrated poet in the colonies. She had published a book of poems in 1773 that had been praised on both sides of the Atlantic. She had corresponded with George Washington, who had invited her to visit him at his headquarters and written her a letter of considerable warmth and admiration. She was, by any measure, a figure of extraordinary intellectual achievement and public recognition, and she had opinions about the Declaration. She had opinions about independence and freedom, and what those words meant when spoken by men who owned other human beings. Those opinions are recoverable from her poetry and her surviving correspondence, and they are devastating in their clarity and their controlled, precise, poetic rage. Phyllis Wheatley was not in the room. She was not asked to contribute. She was not consulted. But she was present in that city, in that moment, and her voice, filtered through the careful constraints of a poetic form she had mastered, precisely because it gave her cover to say things she could not say directly, is one of the most important voices of the founding era. And it is a voice that the official history has spent 2.5 centuries doing its level best to keep at the margins. We are pulling it back to the center, one name at a time.
There is a question that serious historians have been wrestling with for decades, and it is a question that sounds simple on the surface, but becomes more complicated the deeper you push into it. The question is this: who actually wrote the Declaration of Independence? Not who signed it, not who approved it, not who voted for it in the Continental Congress. Who wrote it? Who put the words together? Who sat down with a quill and an inkwell and a blank piece of parchment and produced the document that changed the world? The answer that most Americans carry around is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson wrote it. That is the story. That is the mythology. Jefferson, the brilliant Virginia planter and philosopher-politician, retreating to his rented rooms on the corner of 7th and Market Streets in Philadelphia, composing in a burst of genius the most consequential political document in American history. It is a beautiful story. It is also, like most beautiful stories about powerful men, significantly incomplete. Jefferson himself never claimed sole authorship in the way that the mythology suggests. In his own letters and in his autobiography, Jefferson described his task as not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. He was not claiming to have invented the ideas, he was claiming to have expressed them. And even that claim, the claim to expression, to the particular arrangement of words that produced the Declaration's famous cadences, is more complicated than it appears once you start examining the documentary record with the rigor it deserves. John Adams was deeply involved in the drafting process, far more deeply than the mythology acknowledges. Adams and Jefferson worked together on the Committee of Five, and their collaboration was intense, argumentative, and genuinely generative. Adams pushed back on Jefferson's drafts. He suggested changes. He contributed language. The line between Jefferson's voice and Adams's voice in the final document is not as clear as the historical record has been presented. Benjamin Franklin also made specific edits to Jefferson's draft, and at least one of those edits produced one of the most famous phrases in the document. Jefferson's original draft read, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Franklin changed it to self-evident. That single word, self-evident, transformed the philosophical register of the entire sentence, moving it from the language of religious authority to the language of rational philosophy. One word, Franklin's word, and yet we call the Declaration Jefferson's document. But the question of authorship goes deeper than the Committee of Five.
It goes deeper than the recorded debates and the surviving draft annotations. It goes into the intellectual ecosystem from which the Declaration emerged, an ecosystem that was populated by hundreds of thinkers, writers, philosophers, and political theorists whose ideas Jefferson absorbed, synthesized, and expressed. John Locke is the most obvious influence and the most widely acknowledged. The Declaration's framework of natural rights, of government deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed, of the right of a people to alter or abolish a government that fails to protect those rights, is Lockean political philosophy translated into the specific context of the American colonial situation. Jefferson read Locke. He absorbed Locke. He expressed Locke in language so clear and so powerful that Locke's ideas became accessible to people who had never read a word of political philosophy in their lives. That is not plagiarism. That is synthesis. That is the work of a genuinely gifted political writer. But it means that Locke's ghost is in the Declaration alongside Jefferson's, and Locke is not the only ghost.
There is the influence of Scottish Enlightenment philosophy, particularly the work of Francis Hutcheson, whose writings on natural rights and moral sense theory were widely read in the American colonies, and whose specific formulations of the relationship between life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness predate Jefferson's famous phrase by decades. There is the influence of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason and adopted by Virginia just weeks before Jefferson began drafting the Declaration. Mason's document contains language so similar to Jefferson's that the relationship between the two texts is impossible to characterize as coincidental. Jefferson had read Mason's declaration. He knew it well. He borrowed from it, adapted it, and incorporated its framework into the national document he was producing. George Mason's fingerprints are on the Declaration of Independence, and George Mason did not sign it. This is not a trivial point. George Mason was one of the most important political thinkers of the founding era. He was present at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He refused to sign the Constitution, in part because it failed to include a Bill of Rights, and his opposition was instrumental in ensuring that the Bill of Rights was eventually added. He was a figure of enormous influence and considerable courage, and his intellectual contribution to the Declaration of Independence, which is documentable, traceable, and undeniable, is almost entirely absent from the way Americans learn about that document. Then there is James Wilson. Wilson was a Pennsylvania delegate to the Continental Congress, a legal scholar of formidable ability, and a man whose contributions to the theoretical foundations of American constitutional law are recognized by specialists and virtually unknown to everyone else. Wilson had been writing and speaking about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the philosophical basis for colonial self-governance for years before Jefferson sat down to draft the Declaration. His ideas were circulating in exactly the intellectual environment from which the Declaration emerged. His influence on the document's theoretical architecture is real, even if it is difficult to trace with the precision that direct textual borrowing would provide. Wilson signed the Declaration, so he is not among the hidden, but his story illustrates something important about how the mythology of the founding works. It elevates certain figures, particularly Jefferson, to a status of solitary genius, and in doing so it flattens the rich, complex, collaborative intellectual process from which the document actually emerged. And then there is the category of influence that no one in the official history wants to discuss, the influence of indigenous political philosophy on the founders' conception of governance. This is not a fringe theory. This is not wishful thinking. This is a documented intellectual history that has been reconstructed by serious scholars over the past several decades, and that has slowly, reluctantly begun to make its way into mainstream historical discourse. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, was a sophisticated political union of 6 nations that had been functioning as a constitutional democracy, with representative governance, separation of powers, and mechanisms for peaceful conflict resolution for centuries before any Europeans set foot in North America. Benjamin Franklin knew about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. He had attended consuls. He had studied their governance structure. He had explicitly cited them as a model in his Albany Plan of Union in 1754, which was one of the earliest serious proposals for colonial unification. The idea that a diverse group of sovereign entities could come together under a shared constitutional framework, which is the foundational idea of American federalism, was not invented by European Enlightenment philosophers. It was observed, studied, and adapted from a system of governance that indigenous North Americans had been practicing for generations. The Haudenosaunee were not in the room on August 2, 1776. Their political philosophy was in the room, their model of governance was in the room, and their names are nowhere on the document that their ideas helped to shape. We keep pulling the thread, and the thread keeps leading somewhere that the official history never prepared us to go. There is a word that historians use when they want to describe the process by which certain people get written out of the historical record. The word is occlusion. It comes from the Latin occludere, meaning to shut up, to close off, to block. Occlusion is not the same as erasure, though the two are related. Erasure implies an active, deliberate act of removal, someone taking a pen and crossing out a name, someone burning a document, someone making a conscious decision to eliminate a record. Occlusion is subtler than that. Occlusion is what happens when the machinery of historical recording simply fails to point its lens in a particular direction, when the people doing the recording do not think to ask certain questions, do not think to preserve certain voices, do not think that certain perspectives are worth capturing for posterity. Occlusion is erasure that has learned to look like oversight. And in the story of the Declaration of Independence and its hidden witnesses, occlusion has been working quietly and efficiently for 250 years. To understand how this occlusion operated in practice, we need to spend some time with the specific mechanisms of historical recording in the late 18th century. Who kept records? Who decided what was worth writing down? Who had access to the materials, the education, the time, and the institutional support necessary to produce the kind of documentary record that survives into the future? The answer in 1776, as in most of human history, is a very specific and very narrow category of people: educated, property-owning men of European descent who were connected to institutions, whether governmental, religious, or commercial, that had both the resources and the motivation to maintain archives. Everyone outside that category existed in a documentary shadow. Their lives were real, their contributions were real, their presence was real, but the mechanisms for capturing and preserving that reality were controlled by people who frequently did not see them, did not value them, or actively preferred their absence from the record. This is why we know so much about what John Adams thought and felt during the summer of 1776. Adams was a prolific letter writer, and his letters were preserved, collected, published, and studied. His wife Abigail was equally prolific, and her letters have been preserved and studied as well, though it took considerably longer for historians to treat them as primary sources of serious historical significance, rather than as charming domestic accessories to the real history happening in the rooms where her husband worked. We know what Adams ate for breakfast. We know what kept him awake at night. We know the texture of his anxieties and the shape of his ambitions with an intimacy that feels almost intrusive. And that is not an accident. It is the result of 250 years of institutional investment in preserving and amplifying the documentary record of a specific category of person. Now contrast that with what we know about Caesar Rodney. Rodney was a Delaware delegate who made one of the most dramatic and consequential journeys of the entire founding period. In the early hours of July 2, 1776, the day when the Continental Congress voted on independence, Rodney received an urgent message that Delaware's delegation was deadlocked and his vote was needed to break the tie. Rodney was in Dover, Delaware, approximately 80 miles from Philadelphia. He was also seriously ill, suffering from a facial cancer that had been slowly disfiguring him and would eventually kill him. He rode through the night, through a thunderstorm, changing horses multiple times, arriving in Philadelphia just in time to cast the vote that gave Delaware to the independence column and helped secure the unanimous colonial support that the Declaration needed to carry its full political weight. It is a genuinely extraordinary story. It is one of the great acts of physical and political courage in the founding period, and Rodney is relatively well known compared to most of the hidden figures we have been discussing in this script. But here is what is interesting about Rodney's story. We know it primarily because of letters that other people wrote about him. His own documentary record is sparse. He did not have the kind of institutional backing, the kind of social network invested in preserving his voice that Adams and Jefferson and Franklin enjoyed. His story survived almost by accident, preserved in the margins of other people's accounts, referenced in passing by delegates who happened to mention his dramatic arrival. If those references had not been made, if the people who witnessed his arrival had not thought to write it down, Caesar Rodney's midnight ride would be as unknown today as the names of the people who changed his horses along the way. And those people, the stable masters and innkeepers and ordinary Delaware residents who made Rodney's journey physically possible, are completely invisible in the historical record. They are there in the logic of the story. You cannot ride 80 miles through a thunderstorm and change horses multiple times without other human beings making that possible. But their names are gone.
Their faces are gone. Their contribution to the vote that declared American independence is gone.
This is occlusion. This is how it works. Not in dramatic moments of deliberate destruction, but in the quiet, systematic failure to point the lens of history at the full range of human beings who were present and contributing and shaping the outcome of events. And once you start to see it, once you develop the ability to read historical accounts for their absences as well as their presences, you start to see it everywhere. You start to notice the passive voice constructions that indicate a deliberate choice not to name an actor. You start to notice the footnotes that reference unnamed servants, unnamed assistants, unnamed members of the crowd. You start to notice the places where the documentary record goes suddenly thin, where the correspondence stops, where the diaries fall silent. And you start to understand that those silences are not accidental. They are structural. They are the shape of a society that decided at its very foundation whose story was worth telling. There is a letter that exists in the archives of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania that very few people outside of specialized academic circles have ever read. It was written in August of 1776 by a Philadelphia merchant named Robert Proud, who was a Loyalist and a Quaker schoolteacher, and who therefore occupied a particularly complex position in the Revolutionary moment. Proud was opposed to independence on both political and religious grounds, but he was also a careful observer, an educated man with a habit of detailed record-keeping, and his letter from August of 1776 contains something that most official accounts of the founding do not. It contains a description of the crowds that gathered outside the State House during the proceedings. He describes the composition of those crowds with a specificity that is almost jarring in its contrast to the official mythology. He mentions in passing and without particular emphasis the presence of free black Philadelphians, of women, of German-speaking immigrants who were clustered together trying to understand what was being said, of indigenous traders who had come to the city for commercial purposes and found themselves witnessing something whose significance they were actively trying to assess. He describes the energy of the crowd not as uniformly celebratory but as anxious, complicated, a mixture of hope and fear and confusion that reflects the genuine complexity of a population being told that its world was about to change fundamentally without having been consulted about whether it wanted that change or what form it should take. Robert Proud's letter is not cited in most histories of the founding. It does not fit the narrative. It introduces too much complexity, too much ambiguity, too many faces that the mythology was not designed to accommodate. And so it sits in an archive in Pennsylvania, read by specialists, ignored by the broader culture. One more piece of evidence for a history that is larger, messier, more human, and more honest than the one we were given. We are going to keep reading those letters. We are going to keep opening those archives. And we are going to keep finding the faces that the mythology left behind.
Let us talk about money, because as much as the founding mythology wants to frame the Declaration of Independence as a purely philosophical and political act, a moment of collective moral awakening in which enlightened men chose principle over comfort and liberty over safety, the economic dimensions of the American Revolution are impossible to separate from its ideological ones. In fact, if you want to understand why certain people were in that room in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, and why certain other people were not, you need to follow the money. You need to understand who had economic skin in the game, who stood to gain from independence and who stood to lose, and how those economic interests shaped the political process that produced the Declaration in ways that the official history has consistently preferred to present as purely principled deliberation. The 13 colonies by 1776 were not a unified economic zone. They were 13 distinct economic ecosystems with different productive bases, different trading relationships, different labor systems, and different relationships to the British mercantile system that had been governing their economic life for more than a century. New England had its fishing fleets and its maritime trade networks. The middle colonies had their agricultural surpluses and their commercial cities. The southern colonies had their plantation economies,
built on the forced labor of enslaved people producing tobacco, rice, and indigo for export to British markets. These three regional economies had different relationships to British rule, different grievances against it, and different visions of what economic independence might look like and what it might cost. The men who represented these economies in the Continental Congress were not disinterested philosophers. They were economic actors with specific interests, specific anxieties, and specific calculations about what independence would mean for their wealth, their trade, and their futures. Robert Morris is perhaps the most important economic figure of the founding period that most Americans have never heard of. Morris was a Philadelphia merchant and financier who had built one of the largest commercial fortunes in the colonies through a trading network that stretched from the Caribbean to Europe. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, so his name is technically on the parchment. But his role in the Revolution went far beyond signing a document. Morris became the superintendent of finance for the Continental government in 1781, and in that capacity he essentially served as the one-man central bank of the American Revolution. He used his personal credit, his personal relationships with European banking houses, and his extraordinary commercial network to keep the Continental Army financed during the darkest periods of the war, when the Continental Congress was broke, when the currency it had issued had become nearly worthless, and when the military situation was so desperate that the survival of the revolutionary project seemed genuinely uncertain. Without Robert Morris's financial engineering, without his willingness to pledge his personal fortune as collateral for the debts of a government that did not yet fully exist, the Revolutionary War might well have ended very differently.
But Morris did not work alone. Behind him was a network of merchants, financiers, and commercial figures whose money and credit made his operations possible. Some of these people were in Philadelphia. Some were in other colonial cities. Some were in Europe, in the counting houses of Amsterdam and Paris and Bordeaux, where sympathy for the American cause was intertwined with calculations about what American independence would mean for trade routes, for competition with Britain, and for the balance of economic power in the Atlantic world. These people were participants in the founding in a direct and consequential sense. Their money built the army. Their credit bought the weapons. Their commercial networks supplied the food and the uniforms and the ammunition, without which the political philosophy of the Declaration would have remained exactly that, philosophy, with no military force to give it reality. And their names are not part of the story that Americans learn when they learn about the Declaration of Independence. Among the financiers whose contributions have been most thoroughly obscured is a man named James Salomon. Salomon was a Polish-born Jewish immigrant who had come to America before the Revolution and established himself as a successful broker and financial agent in Philadelphia. When the Revolutionary War began, Salomon threw himself into the patriot cause with a commitment that went far beyond what prudence or self-interest would have recommended. He was captured by the British twice. The first time, he used his multilingual abilities. He spoke English, French, German, Polish, and several other languages, to work as an interpreter for the British, a position he used to help French and American prisoners escape. The second time he was captured, he was condemned to death. He escaped. He returned to Philadelphia and resumed his financial operations in support of the Continental government. Over the course of the war, Salomon made loans to the Continental Congress that by some historical estimates totaled in the millions of dollars in contemporary value. Loans that were often made at little or no interest. Loans that were frequently never repaid. Loans that he made knowing that his personal financial ruin might be the consequence. James Madison, who would later become the fourth President of the United States, wrote in his correspondence about his personal financial dependence on James Salomon during the Revolutionary period, describing Salomon's generosity with a gratitude that makes clear exactly how significant that support was. James Salomon died in 1785, bankrupt, his fortune consumed by the loans he had made to a government that never fully repaid him. His family spent years trying to recover the debts owed to his estate. Congress never acted on their petitions. The man who helped finance the American Revolution died broke, and his name is not in the history books that most Americans read. There is a statue of him in Chicago, erected in the 1940s,
standing between George Washington and Robert Morris in a bronze tableau that is itself somewhat obscure and rarely visited. That statue, in a very real sense, more historical justice than Haym Salomon received in his own lifetime, or in the 2 centuries of American mythology that followed his death. Then there were the women whose economic contributions to the revolutionary cause have been almost entirely written out of the official record. The women who ran farms and businesses while their husbands were away fighting or attending Congress. The women who organized boycotts of British goods. The Daughters of Liberty, whose economic activism in the years leading up to the Revolution was a genuinely significant factor in the political pressure that pushed the colonies towards independence. The women who ran the domestic manufacturing operations that produced the homespun cloth, the preserved food, and the countless other material necessities that kept colonial households functioning during the years of British trade restrictions. These were not passive participants in someone else's revolution. They were economic actors whose decisions and whose labor had direct consequences for the success of the revolutionary project. And their contribution has been reduced in the official history to a footnote about Betsy Ross sewing a flag, a story that is itself almost certainly mythological. The economic history of the founding is the history of who had resources and who did not, who could afford to be in Philadelphia and who could not, who had the financial cushion to absorb the risks of revolution, and who was one bad harvest away from ruin. The 56 signers were, almost without exception, men of considerable property. They could afford to sign. They could afford the risk. And behind them, invisible in the official record, were the people whose economic labor made their prosperity possible, and whose financial support made their revolution survivable. We owe them more than a footnote.
There is a moment that happens in every serious historical investigation, a moment that researchers and archivists and historians know well, when the document you are reading stops being an artifact and starts being a window, when the faded ink and the archaic handwriting and the water-damaged margins stop being obstacles to understanding and start being the understanding itself, when you look at what is written and simultaneously at what is not written, and you realize that the absence is the message, that the silence is speaking, that the gap in the record is not a failure of preservation, but a deliberate architectural feature of a historical narrative that was built to exclude certain truths and protect certain myths. That moment is uncomfortable. It requires you to revise things you thought you knew. It requires a kind of intellectual courage that is rarer than it should be, the courage to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere that challenges the stories you were raised on, the stories that gave your understanding of the world its shape and its stability. We have been in that moment throughout this entire script, and now we are going to go deeper into it, because there is a dimension of the Declaration's hidden history that we have circled around but not yet entered directly. It is the most personal dimension. It is the dimension that lives not in archives or financial records or diplomatic correspondence, but in the private experiences of the people who were closest to the founding moment and who paid the highest personal price for a revolution that promised them liberation and delivered them something considerably more complicated. Let us talk about the children, not metaphorically, literally. The children who were present in Philadelphia during the summer of 1776, the children who grew up in the households of the delegates, the children who ran through the streets of the city while history was being made in the buildings their parents entered every morning, the children who absorbed, through the particular osmosis of childhood, the arguments and the anxieties and the contradictions of the founding moment, and who carried those things with them into adulthood, into their own historical moment, into the next chapter of the American experiment. John Adams brought his son John Quincy Adams to Europe in 1778, when John Quincy was 10 years old, to serve as his secretary and companion during the diplomatic missions that were the direct consequence of the independence declared 2 years earlier. John Quincy Adams would go on to become the 6th President of the United States, and historians have noted that his political views, his understanding of American identity, his approach to questions of liberty and justice, were shaped in profound and specific ways by his childhood proximity to the founding moment. He was there, not in the room, not signing anything, but there in the ecosystem of the founding, breathing its air, absorbing its arguments, watching the adults around him struggle with the gap between the ideals they were proclaiming and the compromises they were making. But John Quincy Adams at least has a historical presence. He became president. His story was preserved because of what he became. What about the children who were there and who did not become presidents? What about the children of the enslaved people who worked in the households of the delegates? What about the children of the free black Philadelphians who lived in the city during the Revolutionary Summer? What about the children of the Quaker families who were watching the Revolution with deep religious unease? These children were present in the same city, breathing the same air, absorbing the same moment. Their experience of it was radically different from John Quincy Adams's experience of it, and their experience has left almost no trace in the official historical record.
There is one exception that is partial and painful and worth examining in detail. His name was Richard Allen. Allen was born into slavery in Philadelphia in 1760, which means he was 16 years old during the summer of 1776. He was there. He was in that city. He heard, or very likely heard, the Declaration read aloud in the public squares of Philadelphia. He was 16 years old, enslaved, hearing the words, "All men are created equal," proclaimed in the city of his birth by men who owned human beings. And he had to do something with that experience, had to find somewhere inside himself to put the particular anguish of hearing those words in that condition. Allen went on to become one of the most significant figures in African American religious and political history. He founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1816, the first independent black denomination in the United States, an institution that became a cornerstone of African American community life and political organizing for the next 2 centuries. The AME Church was not just a religious institution, it was a political one. It was a space where black Americans could gather, organize, educate themselves, and build the collective capacity for resistance and self-determination that the Declaration of Independence had promised and the American legal system had denied. Richard Allen's founding of the AME Church was, in a very real sense, his answer to the Declaration of Independence. His declaration that if the promise of that document was not going to be delivered by the existing institutions of American society, then black Americans would build their own institutions, would create their own framework for the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. He was 16 in 1776. He was doing the intellectual and spiritual and organizational work of the founding moment for the rest of his life. And his name is not in the history books alongside Jefferson and Adams and Franklin, even though the institution he built has arguably done more to extend the actual promise of the Declaration to a broader range of Americans than anything the original 56 signers produced. Now, let us go to another child, a girl this time. Her name was Deborah Sampson, and she was 15 years old in 1776, living in Massachusetts, already experiencing the particular constraints that the Revolutionary era placed on women who had the wrong kind of intelligence, the wrong kind of ambition, the wrong kind of refusal to accept the boundaries that their society had drawn around their possibilities. Sampson would go on to do something extraordinary. She would disguise herself as a man, enlist in the Continental Army under the name Robert Shirtliff, and serve for more than a year as a soldier in the revolutionary cause before her biological sex was discovered. She was wounded twice. She successfully treated one of her own wounds herself, digging a musket ball out of her own thigh with a penknife, because she was terrified that a military surgeon would discover her secret. She was honorably discharged in 1783, and after years of petitioning, she eventually received a pension from the federal government for her military service, the first woman in American history to receive such recognition. Deborah Sampson was 15 in 1776. She grew up in a revolutionary moment that told her liberty was a universal human right, and simultaneously told her that she was not fully human enough to exercise it. She resolved that contradiction the only way available to her, by disguising her humanity to claim her liberty. And her story, which is extraordinary, which is cinematic,
which is the kind of story that should be taught in every American school alongside Paul Revere's Ride and George Washington crossing the Delaware, is known by a fraction of the people who could tell you the name of John Hancock. These are not marginal figures. These are not footnotes. These are the people in whom the actual meaning of the Declaration of Independence was tested, contested, and ultimately expanded beyond what its original authors were willing or able to imagine. They are the true heirs of the founding moment. They are the ones who took the words seriously enough to demand that they be applied universally, and they deserve to stand at the center of the story, not at its edges. We are almost there. The center is just ahead.
We have traveled a long way together through this story. We have moved from the official mythology of 56 men signing a parchment in Philadelphia to the vastly more complex, more human, more honest reality of a founding moment that involved hundreds of people whose names, faces, voices, and contributions have been systematically occluded by the machinery of historical memory. We have talked about enslaved people and free Black Americans, about women and children, about indigenous political philosophers and immigrant financiers, about scribes and tavern keepers, and ordinary Philadelphia residents who stood in the summer heat and heard words that were simultaneously the most radical promise ever made in the name of a government and the most spectacular lie ever told by one. We have followed the money and the documents and the letters and the silences. And now, in this second-to-last section, before we bring everything together in our conclusion, I want to do something that historians rarely do. I want to speculate, carefully, responsibly, but genuinely. I want to ask the question that the evidence has been pushing us toward throughout this entire script. What would America look like today if those 144 hidden people had been included? What would be different? What would be the same? And what does the fact that they were excluded tell us about the America we actually live in right now? This is not an idle question. It is not nostalgia or sentimentality, or the kind of retrospective moralism that historians rightly warn against, the practice of judging historical figures by contemporary standards they could not have known or anticipated. This is a structural question, a question about foundations, because the decisions made at the founding of a nation do not stay in the past. They echo, they compound, they build on themselves across generations in ways that shape the present with a persistence and a power that most people dramatically underestimate. The decision to exclude women from the political community of the new nation was not just a decision about 1776. It was a decision that structured American political life for the next 144 years, until the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, and whose consequences are still visible in contemporary American politics in ways that scholars continue to document and debate. The decision to protect and preserve the institution of slavery rather than confront it at the founding was not just a decision about 1776. It was a decision that made the Civil War inevitable, that produced the particular shape of American racial inequality, that structured the geography and the economics and the social fabric of the nation in ways that a serious reckoning with the evidence suggests have still not been fully resolved. So what if the founding had been different? What if the 200 people who were present in and around the proceedings of the Continental Congress during the summer of 1776 had all been recognized as participants, as contributors, as co-authors of the American project? What if the document that emerged from that summer had been the product of a genuinely diverse deliberation, rather than the product of a deliberation that was diverse only by the narrow standards of the 18th century propertied class? We cannot know, of course. History does not offer us the luxury of controlled experiments. We cannot run the counterfactual and observe the results. But we can look at what was lost. We can examine the specific contributions that were excluded and ask what difference they might have made. And when we do that, when we look at the intelligence and the courage and the philosophical sophistication and the practical wisdom of the people who were shut out of the official founding, the answer that emerges is not comforting. Consider what Phyllis Wheatley might have contributed to a genuine national conversation about the meaning of liberty if her voice had been invited into the deliberations rather than excluded from them. Wheatley had thought more deeply and more honestly about the relationship between freedom and human dignity than most of the men who were signing the Declaration,
because she had experienced the absence of both in ways that Jefferson and Adams and Franklin never had and never would. Her poetry reveals a mind that was grappling with exactly the questions the Declaration claimed to be answering, questions about what it means to be fully human, what it means to be free, what it means to live in a political community that recognizes your humanity rather than denying it. That mind, that voice, that perspective, was available in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. It was not invited in, and the document that resulted from that exclusion is poorer for it, not just morally, but intellectually. The Declaration of Independence would have been a better document, a more honest document, a more truly universal document, if Phyllis Wheatley had been in the room.
Consider what the Haudenosaunee perspective on governance might have contributed to the constitutional framework that was being developed in this period, if it had been engaged with seriously rather than borrowed from selectively. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy had centuries of practical experience with the problem that the founders were trying to solve theoretically. How do you build a stable political union among sovereign entities with different cultures, different interests, and different traditions? How do you create mechanisms for peaceful conflict resolution that are robust enough to survive serious disagreements without fracturing the union? The Haudenosaunee had answers to these questions that were grounded not in philosophical speculation, but in lived political experience. Some of those answers made their way into the American constitutional framework through the filter of Benjamin Franklin's observation and synthesis. But a genuine engagement, a respectful and serious intellectual exchange between the founders and Haudenosaunee political thinkers might have produced something considerably more sophisticated and considerably more durable than what actually emerged. And consider what Haym Salomon's financial sophistication and his experience navigating the economic systems of multiple continents might have contributed to the economic architecture of the new nation if he had been treated as a genuine participant in the founding, rather than as a resource to be extracted and discarded. The United States spent its first several decades in a state of chronic financial instability, struggling with debt, currency problems, and the structural economic contradictions of a nation that was simultaneously committed to free markets and to the slave economy that undergirded a significant portion of its wealth. Some of those problems might have been addressed more effectively at the founding if the people who understood them most clearly had been at the table rather than outside it. And consider, perhaps most importantly, what the ordinary people of Philadelphia, the free black residents, and the German immigrants, and the Quaker families, and the women who ran the households and the taverns and the small businesses of the city, might have contributed to a genuine national conversation about what kind of country this was going to be. These were not people without opinions. They were not people without political sophistication. They were not people whose experience of the revolutionary moment was passive or uncritical. They had been living through the tensions and the contradictions of colonial life in ways that gave them a perspective on what independence might mean and what it might cost that was fundamentally different from the perspective of the men in the State House. And that perspective, that ground-level, lived experience, what does this actually mean for my life perspective, is exactly what the Declaration of Independence most conspicuously lacks. It is a document written from the top down. It is a document that speaks about the people without speaking to them or for them in any genuine sense. And that gap between the document's claims about popular sovereignty and its actual relationship to the population it claimed to represent is a gap that has been generating political conflict in America ever since. None of this is to say that the Declaration of Independence is not a great document. It is. Its ideas are genuinely radical. Its language is genuinely powerful. Its vision of human equality and natural rights, however imperfectly realized in practice, has provided the philosophical ammunition for every significant expansion of American freedom in the 2.5 centuries since its adoption. The abolitionists quoted it. The suffragists quoted it. The civil rights movement quoted it. Every generation of Americans who has fought to extend the promise of liberty to people it was originally designed to exclude has reached for the Declaration as their primary weapon,
which tells you something important about the document's power and its complexity simultaneously. It is powerful enough to be used against itself. It contains within it the seeds of its own expansion, the logic that makes exclusion indefensible once you accept the premise of universal human dignity. But it would have been a better document, a truer document, a more genuinely revolutionary document, if the people who were in that city in the summer of 1776, and whose voices were silenced, and whose names were omitted, and whose contributions were erased, had been part of it from the beginning. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Because the distance between what the Declaration promised and what it delivers is precisely the distance between the 56 names that appear on it and the 144 names that do not. And that distance is the history of America.
We have arrived at the end of this journey. But before I give you the conclusion this story deserves, I want you to do something. I want you to sit with the weight of everything we have covered together. Sit with the names. James Armistead Lafayette, who infiltrated a British military camp and changed the outcome of a war and went home to slavery. Phyllis Wheatley, who wrote poetry of devastating precision about freedom while living without it. Hames Solomon, who financed a revolution with his personal fortune and died broke and forgotten. Richard Allen, who was 16 years old in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 and spent the rest of his life building the institutions the Declaration refused to build for him. Deborah Sampson, who disguised her humanity in order to claim her liberty. Charles Thompson, who kept the records of the founding for 15 years and signed nothing. The Haudenosaunee, whose political philosophy is embedded in the constitutional architecture of a nation that was simultaneously declaring war on their existence. The ordinary Philadelphians, who stood in the summer heat and heard the words "all men are created equal," and felt something complicated move through them, something that was simultaneously hope and fury, and the particular anguish of a promise you already know is not meant for you. Sit with all of them, because they are not footnotes. They are the story. They are the real story. And the fact that most Americans have never heard their names is not an accident of history. It is a choice that history made, and that we have the power to unmake. Let us talk about what it means to unmake that choice. Because this is where the history stops being about the past and starts being about right now, about the present moment, about the choices that we make today, about whose stories we tell and whose we silence, whose contributions we recognize and whose we erase, whose humanity we center and whose we push to the margins. The mechanisms of occlusion that operated in 1776 have not disappeared. They have evolved. They have become more sophisticated, and in some ways more invisible. The tools have changed. The people deploying them have changed. But the basic dynamic, the dynamic of powerful institutions deciding whose story is worth preserving and whose is not, whose voice deserves amplification and whose deserves silence, is still operating with remarkable efficiency in the 21st century. We can see it in whose history gets taught in schools and whose gets labeled revisionist. We can see it in whose monuments get built and whose get torn down and whose never get built in the first place. We can see it in whose names get attached to buildings and universities and holidays, and whose names dissolve back into the anonymous mass of history from which the machinery of memory never bothered to retrieve them.
The Declaration of Independence, in its most honest reading, is an unfinished document, not because its authors failed to complete it, but because the project it announced, The project of building a political community grounded in the universal dignity of all human beings has never been completed. It has been extended, painfully and incrementally, and always against resistance, from the original narrow circle of propertied white men to broader and broader categories of humanity. The abolition of slavery, the extension of citizenship to formerly enslaved people, the recognition of women's right to vote, the dismantling of legal segregation. Each of these expansions required someone to pick up the Declaration and point at the gap between its promises and its practice, and to insist, against enormous opposition, that the gap be closed. And each of those expansions was accomplished by people whose names deserve to stand alongside the 56 signers in the national memory of the founding moment, because they were doing the same work, they were building the same project, they were honoring the same promise more faithfully than the people who originally made it. Frederick Douglass understood this better than almost anyone. In 1852, he delivered a speech that has become one of the most powerful pieces of American rhetoric ever produced. A speech in which he asked what the 4th of July meant to an enslaved American, and answered his own question with a controlled and devastating fury that should be required reading for every person who has ever waved a flag at a fireworks display. Douglass did not reject the Declaration. He held it up. He insisted on it. He said that the principles of the Declaration were sound, that the founders' words were correct, that the document was right, and that the nation's failure to live up to those words was not a minor inconsistency, but a monstrous hypocrisy that demanded immediate and complete correction. He was doing what the hidden people of 1776 had always done. He was taking the promise seriously, more seriously than the people who made it. That is the tradition we are working in right now, in this script, in this moment, when we recover the names of the people who were there and were erased, when we restore their stories to the center of the founding narrative, when we insist that the history of the Declaration of Independence is larger and more complex and more human than the mythology allows, we are doing the same work that Douglass did in 1852, that Richard Allen did in 1816, that Phyllis Wheatley did in 1773. We are taking the promise seriously. We are holding the document up to its own light and demanding that it illuminate more than it was originally designed to illuminate. And here is what that illumination reveals. It reveals that the founding of the United States was not a singular moment of genius produced by 56 extraordinary men. It was a collective human achievement produced by hundreds of people, many of whom were never given credit, many of whom paid enormous personal prices for their participation, many of whom never lived to see the promise of the document extended to cover their own lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren. It reveals that American history is not a straight line from the Declaration to the present, a line of steady progress toward the ideals of liberty and equality. It is a tangled, contested, sometimes agonizing negotiation between the promise and the practice, between the words on the parchment and the reality on the ground, between the mythology and the truth. And it reveals that the people who have done the most important work in that negotiation, the people who have pushed hardest and sacrificed most and contributed most profoundly to the actual expansion of American liberty, are frequently the people who were furthest from the room where the promise was originally made.
There are 250 years of American history between the signing of the Declaration of Independence and this moment, right now, wherever you are watching this, whatever time it is, in whatever corner of the world you occupy. 250 years of people living inside the gap between the promise and the practice, and working, often at enormous personal cost, to close it. That work is not finished. The gap is still there. The promise is still only partially redeemed. And the reason it matters to know the names of the hidden people of 1776, to know James Armistead Lafayette, and Phyllis Wheatley, and Haym Salomon, and Richard Allen, and Deborah Sampson, and Charles Thompson, and the Haudenosaunee thinkers, and the free black Philadelphians, and the immigrant communities, and the women, and the children, and the ordinary residents who stood in the summer heat and heard words that were not yet meant for them. The reason it matters is that knowing their names changes what it means to be an American. It means that being an American is not about inheriting a finished achievement. It is about continuing an unfinished project. It is about accepting responsibility for the gap between the promise and the practice, and doing your part, in whatever way your life makes available to you, to close it. The 56 signers started something. The 144 hidden people continued it, often at greater personal cost, and with less recognition than anyone who signed a document ever faced. And every generation since has had to make the same choice, whether to accept the mythology or to demand the truth, whether to be satisfied with the story they were given or to insist on the larger, harder, more honest story that the evidence supports. You are watching this because something in you already knows that the larger story exists. Something in you already suspects that the version you were given was incomplete. That instinct is correct. That instinct is the same instinct that drove every person in this story who refused to accept the boundaries that history tried to draw around their humanity. Honor it. Follow it. Keep asking the questions that the mythology was designed to prevent you from asking. Because the Declaration of Independence belongs to everyone it claimed to speak for, and it claimed to speak for all of us, every one of us, including the 144 whose names were left off the parchment, but whose presence made the document possible, whose courage made the promise real, and whose stories, recovered and restored, and returned to the center of the national memory where they have always belonged, make America something closer to what it was always supposed to be. The 56 signatures are famous, but the 200 people who were there, that is the Declaration. That is the real one. And now you know their story. Make sure someone else does too.